You know how it is you're chasing that sweet spot of computer performance.
Yeah.
You want your games looking and running just incredibly smoothly, right?
Yeah,
And your creative projects to just flow.
definitely.
But like the thought of spending a fortune or getting totally lost in overly complex tech stuff, it can be a real turnoff.
Absolutely. Nobody wants that headache.
So is there a processor out there that really nails that balance?
Yeah.
Serious power without the crazy price tag and endless tweaking.
Well, that's exactly what we're digging into today.
Ah, okay.
We're doing a deep dive into the AMD Ryzen 7 9800X 3D processor.
The 9800X 3D. Got it.
Yeah, and our mission really is to figure out if this CPU, which kind of blends those Zen 4 cores with AMD's innovative 3D VCache.
Yeah, Vcache thing again.
Right. Does it truly deliver that ideal mix, performance and value? That's the question.
Okay.
So we'll be looking closely at how it's built, how it actually performs in the real world, and, ultimately, is it worth your hard-earned cash?
Okay, let's unpack this 9800X 3D then. You mentioned that 3D Vcache. Our sources keep bringing it up too. It sounds like the magic ingredient here. What actually is it, and why should we be excited?
Right. So what's fascinating here is how AMD physically engineered this thing. Okay, so the 9800X 3D fits into the same AM5 socket, looks pretty similar to other Ryzen 7 chips on the outside.
Standard stuff.
Pretty much. But the key difference is literally stacked right on top of the main processing die.
Stacked, like physically on top.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think of it like adding extra super fast storage directly onto the chip itself. The stacked SRAM, that's the 3D V-cache, it massively increases the amount of high-speed memory that the processor cores can access almost instantly.
Huh.
Imagine like a chef having all their most used spices right there next to the stove instead of across the kitchen.
Oh, okay. Less travel time.
Precisely. That's the kind of advantage this gives the 9800X 3D. It leads to quicker processing, especially when it's dealing with lots and lots of data.
So it's not just more memory. It's like that memory is in the express lane straight to the processor.
That makes sense. What kind of core power and speeds are we talking about then, the actual specs?
Spec-wise, you're getting 8 of AMD's high-performance Zen 4 cores.
8 cores?
Yep, 8 cores, and each of those can handle 2 tasks at once, thanks to SMT, simultaneous multi-threading, so 16 threads total.
Okay, 8 core, 16 thread.
All right. The base speed, the guaranteed speed, is around 3.7 gigahertz, but it can intelligently boost itself, clock higher, up to 5.2 gigahertz, depending on the workload and how cool it's running.
5.2 boost, nice.
Yeah. But the real headline figure, honestly, is that massive 104 megabytes of combined cache.
104 megs, that's huge compared to older chips.
It really is. It's a huge pool of super fast data for the processor to play with. It also has a default power rating, PPT they call it, of 120 watts, though fair warning, it can draw a bit more when it's really pushed hard.
Good to know. What about RAM and PCIe? It supports the latest DDR5 memory, the fast stuff, up to 6400 megahertz if you're into overclocking your RAM. And crucially, it supports PCIe 5.0.
Ah, Gen 5. Important for future GPUs and SSDs.
Exactly. For getting the absolute most out of the newest graphics cards and those super fast NVMe solid-state drives.
Now, if someone's already on a relatively recent AMD system, say AM5, how easy is it to just, slot this new chip in?
Yeah, good question. If you're already running an AM5 motherboard, upgrading to the 9800X 3D should be pretty straightforward.
Okay.
It's the same physical installation process as any other Ryzen CPU for that platform. Drop it in, latch it down.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Well, yeah. The analysis we looked at strongly recommends making sure your motherboard software, the firmware, or BIOS is completely up to date.
Ah, the BIOS update dance.
You know it. But it's really important here for ensuring everything runs smoothly, especially for compatibility with those high-speed DDR5 memory kits.
Right, makes sense.
The test setup we examined, it used a solid mid-range X670 board, 32 gigs of DDR5 running at 6,000 megahertz, and a decent 240 millimeter liquid cooler.
Pretty typical enthusiast setup.
Yeah, exactly. And it reported pretty consistent performance right out of the box. Activating the advertised RAM speeds using XMP or DOCP, basically just clicking a button in the BIOS, was apparently a breeze.
So XMP is like the RAM's easy button for speed.
Pretty much, yeah. It's a preset tuning profile, lets the RAM run at its full rated potential without manual tweaking.
Okay. And what about those of us still clinging, perhaps lovingly, to our trusty AM4 systems? What's the story there?
Ah, okay. If you're coming from AM4, it's a more significant step up, meaning the AM5 platform uses a totally different processor socket, LGA versus PGA on AM4. And crucially, it requires DDR5 memory.
Right. DDR4 won't work?
Nope. DDR5 is a different standard, different slot, so it's not just a CPU swap. You'd be looking at needing a new motherboard and a new set of DDR5 RAM as well.
Okay, so motherboard, CPU, RAM, the core trio.
Exactly. And you'll also likely need a new mounting bracket for your existing CPU cooler. Since the socket dimensions changed, that's usually a small extra cost, but still something to factor in.
Right, so it's less an upgrade, more like building a new foundation for your system.
That's a good way to put it, a whole new foundation.
All right, let's dive into what a lot of people really care about, gaming. Our sources are pretty clear that the 9800X3D is like a real star here. Why does that extra cache make such a big difference when you're just playing games?
Okay, yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. In many modern games, especially the ones that really hammer your processor.
Like competitive shooters or big open worlds.
Exactly, those kinds of games. The speed and, critically, the size of the cache can have a huge impact on how smoothly the game runs. That 3D cache on the 9800X3D lets the processor keep way more of the game's essential data incredibly close to the cores.
Less fetching from slower memory.
Precisely. It drastically reduces latency, the delay for the CPU to get the info it needs, and that translates directly into smoother gameplay, fewer stutters, and often higher average frame rates.
Okay, so quantifiable results.
Yeah, definitely. At 1080p resolution, where the processor often becomes the bottleneck before the graphics card,
Right.
our analysis shows performance gains around 5 to 10% compared to the standard non-3D Ryzen 7800X. This is in CPU-heavy games like Counter-Strike 2 or Rainbow Six Siege.
Up to 10% is pretty noticeable, especially at high frame rate.
It really is. That kind of jump can make a very tangible difference. It leads to a much smoother experience, especially if you're aiming for those super high refresh rates, like 240 hertz or even more. Smoother means more consistent frame times.
Okay, so it shines at 1080p. But what if you're not playing at those lower resolutions? If you've got a powerful GPU and you're gaming at, say, 1440p or even 4K, are you still seeing a benefit from all that cache then?
Absolutely, yes. Even when you move up to higher resolutions like 1440p and 4K, where, yeah, the graphics card is definitely doing more of the heavy lifting.
Right, the GPU limit.
Exactly. But the 9800X 3D still contributes to a more responsive overall system feel within the game. Things like menus loading faster, the game world streaming in more smoothly without those annoying little hitches or stutters as you move around.
The asset streaming smoothness.
Yeah. And just the whole experience feels, well, snappier. Multiplayer shooters, complex simulation titles, things like Microsoft Flight Simulator, strategy games, they tend to put a significant strain on the CPU's cache, and they often see the most noticeable improvements, even at high res.
Okay.
So if you're really after that fluid, high frame rate gaming experience, but you don't necessarily want to shell out for the absolute top-of-the-line, most expensive processor on the market, this chip looks like a very, very strong contender.
Now, gaming is obviously a big draw. But what about people who also use their PCs for other demanding stuff, like video editing, graphic design, maybe 3D rendering? How does that massive cache help, or does it help, in those kinds of creative tasks?
Yeah, good point. The impact of the extra cache on those creative workloads is, well, it's generally a bit more subtle compared to the big jumps we sometimes see in gaming.
Okay, so not quite as dramatic.
Not usually, no, but it's definitely still beneficial. Tasks like encoding videos using Handbrake, applying complex filters or adjustments in Photoshop, rendering 3D scenes in Blender, they all show measurable performance improvements. Typically, it's in the range of about 3 to 5% compared to the non-3D version of the chip, the 7800X.
Okay, 3-5% isn't huge, but it's something.
It is something, yeah. But where it really seems to shine is in what we call mixed-use scenarios.
Mixed use, like multitasking.
Exactly. So imagine you're streaming your gameplay live while you're playing a demanding game, or maybe you're compiling code while also running a couple of virtual machines in the background, or even editing large photos while you've got a bunch of other applications open.
Yeah, real-world messy usage.
Right. That large cache acts like a buffer. It helps keep things running smoothly and minimizes those little slowdowns or hiccups you often encounter when your system is juggling multiple demanding tasks at the same time. It allows the processor to switch between those tasks more efficiently without constantly having to fetch data from slower system RAM.
So it might not be the absolute fastest for, say, just rendering a massive video file compared to something with way more cores.
Correct.
But it's a very capable all-around performer, especially if you do a bit of everything.
That's a perfect way to put it. For users whose primary focus is purely on those really intense, heavily multi-threaded workstation tasks like all-day video rendering or complex scientific simulations, yeah, a processor with more physical cores, maybe like the Ryzen 9 7950X3D, might offer a better overall return just for that specific work.
More cores for more parallel work.
Precisely. But for someone who needs a balanced 8-core processor that truly excels in high-end gaming and is very competent for content creation, the 9800X3D provides this really compelling combination of speed and that incredibly large, low-latency cache.
Okay. Beyond the benchmark numbers and specific tasks, what's the actual day-to-day experience like? Using a system powered by this chip, does that extra cache translate into a feeling of, snappiness, just regular stuff?
Yeah, the feedback we saw suggests the real-world experience is often described as hyper-responsive.
Hyper-responsive, okay.
Think about having like a zillion browser tabs open at once.
Guilty.
Ha, yeah, we all are. That, plus your usual chat apps, maybe a video call running the system barely seems to notice. Large spreadsheets load almost instantly. Even things like compiling software code, which can sometimes take a while, happen noticeably faster.
So less waiting around.
Pretty much. And for content creators who regularly work with really big files, lengthy 4K video projects, multi-gigabyte Photoshop files with tons of layers,
Yeah.
that 104 megabytes of cache acts almost like an always-on turbo button. It smooths out those little micro pauses you often experience when you're scrubbing through timelines, applying effects, or just moving and processing huge amounts of data. It just feels smoother.
Okay, that feel factor is important. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about keeping this chip cool and fed. What are the thermal characteristics and the power demands we should be aware of?
Right, thermals and power, definitely something to consider with modern CPUs. Under very heavy sustained benchmark loads like running Prime 95 or Cinebench on all cores for a long time.
Just stress tests.
Yeah, the real torture tests. The 9800X3D can get up there, high 80s, sometimes approaching 90 degrees Celsius. That's even when paired with a capable 240 millimeter all-in-one liquid cooler.
So it runs warm under full load.
It does. It's designed to push close to its thermal limits to maximize performance. However, in more typical real-world scenarios, gaming, most content creation task temperatures tend to settle in a much more comfortable range, mid-70s to low 80s Celsius.
Which is perfectly fine, really.
Absolutely, within acceptable limits for long-term operation. Noise levels from the cooler in the test setup were reported as quite modest under those typical loads. Not silent, but not jet engine loud either.
What about air cooling? Is that viable?
Oh, yeah. If you prefer air cooling, a high-end dual-tower air cooler, think Noctua NHD15 or similar, should also be perfectly capable of managing the heat effectively. The key, as always, is making sure you have good airflow inside your computer case.
Good case airflow is crucial.
Got it.
And power consumption.
Power-wise, we saw peaks around 160 to 180 watts during intense gaming sessions.
Okay.
And it could draw up to around 220 watts under those really heavy all-core multi-threaded workloads we talked about.
So 220 W peak, that's quite a bit, but maybe not outrageous for this level of performance.
Exactly. It's not the absolute most power-efficient chip on the planet for sure, but the level of performance it delivers, especially in gaming, thanks to that cache, generally justifies the power draw for most people looking at this class of CPU. It's a trade-off.
Okay. Now, for the enthusiasts listening, the people who like to tinker and tweak their hardware, what kind of overclocking headroom does the 9800X3D actually offer? Can you push it much further?
Overclocking. This is an interesting point because that 3D V cache, the stacked cache, does influence the overclocking potential.
How so? Is it more sensitive?
It seems to be, yeah. The general advice, which lines up with AMD's own recommendations, is to be fairly cautious with manually cranking up the voltage to the chip.
Okay. Risk of damaging the cache.
Potentially, or at least reducing its lifespan. So the recommendation is conservative voltages to ensure the long-term health of that stacked cache. However, that doesn't mean you can't tune it at all.
Okay.
There are still effective ways to fine-tune performance. Technologies like Precision Boost Overdrive, PBO, and Curve Optimizer are your friends here.
PBO and Curve Optimizer, those are AMD's auto overclocking and undervolting tools, right?
Essentially, yes. PBO lets the chip boost higher and longer within safe limits, while Curve Optimizer lets you apply a negative voltage offset to each core individually.
Undervolting. How does that help performance?
By reducing the voltage slightly, you lower power consumption and heat. This gives the chip more thermal headroom to automatically boost its clock speeds higher and sustain them for longer periods.
Ah, clever. Less heat, more boost.
Exactly. The analysis we looked at achieved stable operation with a modest undervolt applied using Curve Optimizer, maybe around Medica 15 to negative 20 millivolts per core. It varies per chip.
And the result?
Slightly higher sustained boost clocks across all cores, and maybe a few extra percentage points of performance, particularly in multi-threaded tasks, without significantly impacting temperatures or making the cooler work harder.
So worthwhile gains from tuning, just not massive manual overclocks.
Precisely. During testing, single cores were seen hitting around 5.1 gigahertz occasionally, but typical all-core boost speeds with that kind of PBO and Curve Optimizer tuning hovered in the 4.8 to 4.9 gigahertz range under load. So manage expectations. You're probably not going to see those huge 500 millihertz manual overclocks like you could on some older processor architectures, but there's definitely some extra performance to be unlocked through careful optimization using AMD's built-in tools.
Right. It's not just about the processor in isolation, though, is it? We touched on AM5 earlier. What are the broader advantages of building or upgrading to the AM5 platform that this chip actually sits on?
That's a really important point. Connecting this back to the bigger picture, the AM5 platform offers a genuinely strong set of forward-looking features beyond just the CPU itself.
Like what?
Well, we mentioned PCIe 5.0 already. That's huge. It allows for blazing fast speeds from the latest NVMe SSDs. We're talking speeds that were unimaginable just a few years ago. And it ensures full bandwidth for the next generation of graphics cards whenever they arrive.
Future-proofing the GPU slot.
Kind of, yeah. You also get modern connectivity options like USB 4 becoming more common on AM5 boards. And the motherboards themselves are generally built with pretty robust power delivery systems designed for these higher performance CPUs.
And the RAM situation. DDR5 was pricey initially.
It was, but thankfully, the price of DDR5 memory is becoming increasingly competitive now. Those high-speed kits like DDR5 6000 or 6400 are much more accessible than they were when AM5 first launched.
That helps the overall platform cost.
Definitely. And perhaps most importantly, especially for anyone building a brand new system today, AMD has made a long-term commitment to the AM5 socket. They've promised support for future generations of Ryzen CPUs on this platform, likely through at least 2025, maybe beyond.
Ah, so you might be able to drop in a new CPU later without changing the motherboard.
Exactly. That provides a degree of future-proofing for your investment, which wasn't always a guarantee with platforms in the past. We're also seeing motherboard prices gradually come down a bit from their launch highs, making some of the more feature-rich X670 or even D650E boards more attainable.
Good ecosystem benefits then. Okay, finally, let's talk about the bottom line. The price and the overall value proposition. The 9800X3D does come with a premium price tag compared to its non-3D sibling. Is it actually worth that extra expense?
Yeah, the price premium for that 3D V-cache is definitely a factor you can't ignore. At launch, and generally still, the 9800X3D was noticeably more expensive, maybe £100, £120, or the equivalent difference compared to the standard Ryzen 7 700X100X.
It's quite a jump.
It is. Whether that extra cost represents good value really boils down to your specific needs and what you prioritize most in your system.
Okay, break that down. For whom is it worth it?
If you highly value that elimination of microstutters in games, if you want those consistently high frame rates for competitive play or just super smooth visuals, and if you also appreciate smoother workflows across a variety of tasks, especially that multitasking responsiveness we talked about, then that extra investment starts to look quite compelling. You're paying for that cash, and it delivers tangible benefits in those areas.
But it's not for everyone.
Probably not. If your primary focus is almost entirely on very demanding, heavily multi-threaded professional applications like constant video encoding, complex simulations, heavy virtualization, you might actually find a better price-to-performance ratio with a CPU that simply has more physical cores, even if it lacks the 3D V-cache. More cores might just crunch through that specific type of workload faster for the money.
Right. Or what if you're on a budget?
Yeah. Conversely, if you're on a tighter budget or if your usage is mainly lighter gaming, web browsing, and basic productivity tasks, then the standard non-3D 7800X is already a fantastic gaming CPU in its own right. Or even stepping down to a Ryzen 5 model might be a more sensible financial choice for you.
Makes sense.
The 9800X 3D really seems to hit its stride for those users who want a truly fantastic, top-tier, high frame rate gaming experience while also having the horsepower to tackle demanding creative tasks or heavy multitasking without significant compromises. It's for that balanced high-performance user.
Okay, So to kind of sum things up then, the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D appears to be a really well-rounded processor. It effectively uses its, frankly, impressive 3D V-cache to deliver genuinely outstanding gaming performance
Yep.
and a noticeably smooth and responsive experience
Uh-huh.
across a really wide range of applications. And it does all this within the modern and, as you said, forward-looking AM5 platform.
That's a great way to put it. I think the key takeaway is that while, yes, it does cost more than the standard 7800X, that extra investment delivers tangible, often feelable benefits, especially for gamers who also maybe stream or edit videos or just do a lot at once. That 3D V-cache is the real differentiator here. It provides that extra level of responsiveness and smoothness that you can actually notice day to day.
And so, to answer our initial question from the top, does the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D justify its premium price? It seems the answers are pretty clear. It depends. But for those specific users who place a high value on smooth, high-fast gaming and responsive multitasking without necessarily needing the absolute core count extremes of the high-end workstation market, it certainly makes a very, very strong case for itself.
Absolutely. And this whole discussion kind of raises a fascinating question, maybe for you to think about after this. As both games and software applications continue to evolve, as they become increasingly complex and data intensive, how will innovative technologies like this stacked cache, this 3D V cache, further reshape our expectations? What will processor performance and overall system responsiveness look like in the years ahead? It's definitely an exciting area to watch.